Okay, so moving on from there, let's talk about actually writing the introduction. There's also a couple more APA things that we'll cover. Oh, actually, before I forget, I mentioned about indenting your references after the second line. So this is what that looks like. So notice how it's double spaced, but there's not extra spaces between the references. So the first line is normal, then anything after that is indented. So don't, here's one. So see the first one normal, and then second one's indented. If you actually, I'll show you this too. It might sometimes doesn't work if you indent, like if you go to the second line and hit tab. Um, so for some reason, what you have to do is go to the last line towards the end, hit tab. That'll do it. Otherwise, it'll just like indent the whole thing. Okay. All right. So when it comes to an introduction, like I said, this is going to be a review of the prior literature, general topic, why it's the topic and why it's important, and then your question and what we don't know that's kind of filling a gap in the literature, and then your hypothesis, and also a brief overview of your methods. So we'll go through each of those in detail. But just kind of think about those things as things you need to cover. But a few clarifications, and again, we'll go through these individually. But the biggest problem I see when students write introductions is usually that they don't really, they're just too unfocused. Like they're kind of a few different random articles that are sort of related. Um, and then it kind of, there's the research question and it kind of comes out of nowhere. And they don't really have this kind of logical flow like you see here, where it's okay, here's what we know, but here's what we don't know. Here's what I'm asking, uh, and here's what I'm predicting. So just try to think about that, how it's kind of going to focus and narrow down to your topic and specifically what you're asking. Also, along these lines, a big issue I see is just that um, you only should be really reviewing literature that's closely related to your topic. So there's something that motivates your hypothesis or is kind of a starting ground for your research, then of course you should be discussing it. However, if you can look at it and see, well, I don't really know how this relates to my question, then you shouldn't be bringing it up. So again, we want to have a statement of a problem, a literature review, an intro to the methodology, and then a hypothesis. I'll show you examples. So there was a little bit of flexibility in your paper. Sometimes, well, most of the time you start a little bit more general with kind of the general topic of say, okay, why is cheating important? Why do we need to know what motivates people to cheat, or if that's your Springboard article, or how can we improve people's health? You know, that's the general topic. How do we make people be more extroverted? And why is it good to be extroverted? Then you kind of transition into say, or just as an example, the Springboard and all your related articles. And again, kind of building up to what is your question. Um, so that's kind of the first part. Again, just what is the general topic? Why is it important? And then you're going to kind of build up to whether to what your question is. Now, again, there is a bit of flexibility here. Sometimes it makes more sense to just state the question outright. So kind of your specific question might go earlier, or you might kind of build up to it and then state it at the end, or towards the end of your introduction, rather, not at the end, because that's where your hypothesis goes. Or sometimes it's kind of mixed. But bottom line is we want to know, of course, what is your question and why is it important. So make sure you're covering that. In terms of the literature review, so this is where you're going to summarize previous work. And again, it should only be stuff that's related to your topic. So the more relevant articles you can find, the better. You should have 5 primary sources, including your Springboard article. So here you're going to summarize again, what have other people done related to this topic? What do we currently know should translate into, or rather transition into, what do we not know that I'm going to investigate? Okay. Now, an important thing I want to emphasize when you're writing your literature, when you're talking about what prior work is already established, um, you want to be very careful about what you include or don't include. Okay, so if it's something that's really close to your study, like you're using very similar methodology to them, or your experiment is a direct, pretty close to a direct extension of what they did. Well, then it makes a lot of sense to talk about them in a little more detail, right? So talk about maybe their methodology a bit, since you're going to be using that methodology, the results, maybe even if you're building off something they suggested as future research, you could bring that up as well. On the other hand, if you're summarizing literature that's less related to your topic but is worth mentioning, well, then obviously you shouldn't be going into too much detail there. Okay. Another thing I want to say is that there's some things that are just not worth putting into your introduction at all, like say number of participants or what their exact results were. So you want to have their results, but you don't want to necessarily have, or I'd say almost never have, oh, they found that participants in this condition scored 5 out of 10, whereas in this condition they scored 7 out of 10. Like, just kind of think about how important is this to my study and to my reader? Do we need to know that participants, showed a benefit of doing some manipulation, or do we need to know the specific numbers? Probably not the specific numbers, right? Do we need to know something like where the study was conducted? I can't think of a reason why. Do we need to know um, how many participants they used? I would say no, right? So again, just think about when you're citing other literature, what is important, and what will be just filling up space, right? Um, Now, another thing is be sure to cite um, whenever you're talking about other research, of course. So again, if you drew inspiration from these other studies, then you, of course, should be citing them as well. So if you said, if you're using methodology that's similar to someone else's, you sure was inspired by someone else's paper, you, of course, need to cite them and say, we used a similar methodology to this person. Um, so some things to think about too is what are the weaknesses of previous studies? How can their work be extended? But only if you are fixing. Okay. So, for example, let's say you found some limitation in the virtual reality study, and that was what you wanted to address in your experiment. Well, then it's certainly worth bringing up that limitation or weakness of the previous study, because that can then transition you into, um, since whoever it was did not look at this, we um, we investigated that very topic, right? So again, my point is that you don't want to be bringing up weaknesses or extensions of their work if it's not really something you're actually looking at. So there might be a different study you reference just on, say, how extroversion is good for you, but it's not something you plan to investigate or improve on. Well, then you shouldn't really bring it up. Okay. If there is something that's a limitation or a weakness that you plan to address in your study, then of course you should bring it up. So again, just think about things through the lens of what am I asking? What is my question? Um, because that's the stuff you should be building up to. Okay? And this all kind of feeds into the info you provided should be leading the reader to believe what you're proposing to do makes sense. Again, it's kind of just not really relevant to what you're doing or not helping it make more sense when you bring up stuff that is not relevant to what you're doing or is not something you're actually going to address or investigate. Okay, the next part is going to be a brief summary or a brief intro to the methods that will be used in the present study. So, and then also your hypothesis. 95% of the time, the hypothesis comes last. There might be a few cases where you put your hypothesis before talking about your methods, but that's rare. So general, just to not complicate things, just follow the structure. Brief overview of your methods. Now, what we mean by a brief overview is that we're not going to go into too much detail, obviously. So we're not going to, say all the details like how many subjects did you use, what were the number of stimuli you used, where did you get your stimuli, whatever. It's just going to be like a couple sentences summarizing your methods. Okay, and again, we'll look at examples of all this in just a bit. And then, of course, lastly, you're going to state your hypothesis. So that's kind of another way to think about summarizing your methods is they should be enough that people can comprehend your hypothesis, right? So if you're again doing something with virtual reality and health, you don't need to tell. You shouldn't be telling all the details of your methods, but it should be enough that when you state your hypothesis, people are able to understand the hypothesis. Okay? And by the way, just on that note, the reason that we don't go into too much detail on the methods and it's just an overview is because the method section is next, and that's where you will provide all the detail. You will provide all the information that you can think. Well, all the information you can think of, all the details and participants and stimuli and all that stuff. Okay. So another thing I want to talk about with regard to your introductions is that it should be professional and should be a formal tone. Okay. So a big one is you don't want it to sound like a diary. Okay, you don't want to be saying things like, I found this article and I thought it was interesting and this gave me the idea, um, and it occurred to me, like stuff like that is not what we would put in an APA paper. So actually to declare, so kind of on that note, also don't use I. You are technically allowed to use I in APA, last I checked, but they change it every month. But I really would recommend you don't, just because it's not using I that's the problem in itself, but it just tends to encourage bad habits, right? Because you can use I, but if you use it in a formal tone, then it's okay. But I would just recommend not using it all because it kind of encourages you to write like it's a diary and just kind of reflect on things, which is not what we do. We want to state things in a more professional manner. It also shouldn't be anything like a newspaper article. Shouldn't be a story really. While we're on the subject, let's talk about referencing. So there's actually two components to when you reference papers. You have your actual references section at the end. That's where you list all the papers you cited in the text. In the text, you're going to actually cite them in a different way. And it's kind of a shortened way. So make sure you don't refer to the article titles in the text citation. So when you're, again, I'll show you examples in a bit, but when you're in your introduction, when you're talking about this person found this, you're not going to say the article. So you are, of course, going to say that in your references page that comes at the end, but not in what they call the in-text citation. Um, it also should be last names only, not doctor or PhD, and no first names or middle names. Just also on that note, it's good to use comparative language to kind of integrate coverage of your different studies. So whereas Stewart and Jackman found that mutants perform better on the test, divided attention, McKellen and Berry's results suggest that this may not be true for all types of reactions. Um, by the way, that's kind of another thing to think about when you're writing your introduction is how do the studies kind of compare and contrast? So let's say in this one, you were looking to figure out why McKellen and Berry found this is not true for all distractions, but Stewart and Jackman um, found it, to be consistent with all distractions or whatever it might be. Um, well, it makes it flow a lot better and kind of helps build up to your question when you're comparing the studies. So rather than just kind of having, here's this study, then here's another study, then here's another study, they should kind of connect in some way. Okay? Think about that as well. I'm not allowing quotes for this assignment, so you have to paraphrase quotes. The problem with quotes is that I don't know if you've actually read it and understand it or not. So that's why I'm saying you have to paraphrase, like you did in the first assignment. Okay, so a few more things on citations. There's a lot of specific rules in the APA manual, so you actually do things differently depending on the number of authors. You can also cite them known as in parentheses or outside, which we'll cover. Another thing is when you only want to cite the person once per paragraph, unless you need to clarify who it is you're talking. Okay, so let me give you an example. This is not correct. So this is what you shouldn't be doing. Some argue we're able to recognize information in one of two ways. Yonalinus 2002. One way is recollection or memory for the specific details of an event, Yonalinus 2002. The other way is familiarity, blah, 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 Yonalinus 2002. Okay, so we don't do that. We don't cite them more than once in the same paragraph, with an exception that I'll get to next. The only exception is that, and let me just also clarify, you do cite them again, like fully, like this with the name and the year, each time you start a new paragraph. So if I do another paragraph, then I would need to cite Yonalinus again if I'm talking about his work. Okay, so the only exception, like I've been alluding to, is if you do need to clarify who you're talking about. So here's an example of that. One way to some argue that we were able to recognize information in one of two ways. Yonalinus 2002. Wixton, on the other hand, argues this. And then I go on to say dual process model. Sorry, it's a bit cut off here. I should say described by Yonalinus. That's what I mean. So when I talk about the dual process model, I wanted to clarify that that's the Yonalinus 2002 paper. So you just say his name. So that's the only exception. Again, like if you need to clarify, if you're still in the same paragraph again, but you need to clarify who you're talking about, then just say the last name. Okay? And again, if it's a new paragraph, then just cite them again like normal, like this, which we'll get next. Okay. So when it comes to citation, like I said, citations, there's differences depending on the number of authors. This is what it should look like when you have a single. 2000, Stewart 2002 found that, whatever. It shouldn't be Patrick Stewart, so obviously no first names, no first initials or middle names either, no misters, no doctors. Okay. So this is one way to cite. This is known as outside of parentheses, meaning you just state their name and then you put the year in parentheses right after. Okay. So that's pretty self-explanatory, hopefully. Again, putting the name and then the year in parentheses right after it. That's one way. The other way you can do it is just to cite both the name and the year in parentheses. So mutants score higher on, and then you would just at the end of that sentence say the name and the year both in parentheses together. Okay. By the way, there should be a comma here if you cite them in parentheses, or fully in parentheses. Okay. Here's again what that looks like if you're citing Patrick Stewart from 2000. In parentheses would be the last name, comma, and 2000, all in parentheses. Also notice the space here. In text, it's just going to be Stewart. So the name, again, only the last name, and then the year in parentheses. Okay. So when you have two authors, things change a little bit. Now you're just going to say Stewart and McKellen. Well, or rather, that's one option. So Stewart and McKellen, and then the year again in parentheses. So this is the non-parentheses thing, where you just have their names in regular text. On the other hand, you can, of course, cite two authors in parentheses. So that's just going to look like this. Stewart and McKellen, comma 2000, pretty similar to the previous one we saw here. One important thing to remember, I don't know who comes up with these rules or why they matter that much, but we do have to follow them, I guess. So if you do it not in parentheses, so like this one here, Stewart and McKellen, it should say and, Stewart and McKellen, and then parentheses, the year. On the other hand, if you're putting the names in parentheses like here, you should have this little and symbol, not the word. Okay, so take note of that. And then again, just like the single author in parentheses, we have the comma space, the year. Okay, so again, one more time. If the names are in text, it should say and, A-N-D. If it's in parentheses, both the names are in parentheses rather, it should have this symbol. Okay, so again, this is what that looks like. Okay. Lastly, if you have three or more authors, then it's pretty close to the two authors actually, except for one thing. So, or actually, I forgot they changed this fairly recently, but rather than saying all the names, you're going to say et al. Just the first name, and then you're going to say et al. Okay, so anytime you have three or more authors, it's just going to be the first name, or sorry, the first author's last name, not first name. So if it's what was it, Patrick Stewart, it would just be Stewart. Or if it was Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, and Hugh Jackman, it would just say Stewart, E-T-A-L. I don't know what that means. I think just and others or something. I don't know. I didn't make it. And then just like the other ones, you're going to have the year in parentheses if you cite it this way. So again, Stewart, if you have more, three or more authors. So, and then of course, we can also cite that fully in parentheses, meaning you have the name and the year in parentheses instead of just the name. And that's pretty straightforward too. It's just kind of say Stewart et al. And then a comma, and then the year. By the way, don't forget the period after et al. Okay. Again, here's what that looks like. It's all these people. It's just going to be just the first author's last name. So Stewart et al. Okay. There is one exception to that rule, however, and this is when you have. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, we're getting to that next. If you do have two articles with the same authors in the same order and same year, you just add a letter after each year. So if I have two different articles by Stewart, both published in the year 2000, make it just 2000A, 2000B. And by the way, you're going to, and then other than that, it's the same. So again, if it was Stewart and a bunch of other authors, then just say Stewart et al., but 2000A instead of just 2000. And then 2000B for the second article. And this lowercase letter should be added for both the in-text citation, so this part, and then again in your references page. Okay. Okay, so here's the only exception. If you do happen to have multiple papers that an et al. Would make them look too similar. So for example, let's say you had this paper with Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, and Hugh Jackman. Then you had this one, Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, and Halle Berry. This is different from this example because this one has the same authors. This one has different authors, but the problem is that both of them should be et al. So that would make it ambiguous as to who it is you're talking about. So if we actually do have a different author, but it's not the first, so if we have a later author that is different between papers, but the et al. Citation would make it look the same, then you're just going to list as many names as you need to make it clear. Okay, so if I were to cite both of these, if we did it wrong, would be Stewart et al. 2000, which is not, it's not clear which I'm talking about. We're not going to use A and B here because it is different authors. The third author is different on the papers. So in this example, we would just say as many authors as we need to clarify who the paper's from. So we're just going to say the 3 authors now instead of et al. Because otherwise it would be unclear which paper we're talking about. And again, you don't. And so in this particular example here, we need all 3 authors, so that's why there's no et al. But if you didn't need all 3 authors, like this one here, then you can do just as many as you need to be clear and then save. Okay. Alrighty. So that's everything I wanted to go over. Next I will, or for now rather, next I will walk you through a paper of mine and highlight what an introduction should look like.